All right. Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and take a look at the Revolutionary War in just one short video. But to make sure we're all on the same page, I do want to give a very brief timeline of what we've covered so far. First, Christopher Columbus attempted to find India and missed badly. Luckily, he ran into, well, he never actually got to North America, but the Americas, so good for him. 1585, England tried to colonize at Roanoke. 1587, it was, what Roanoke? We don't know anything about Roanoke. Let's not talk about that again. 1607, Jamestown, John Smith, Pocahontas, the Powhatan tribe. You know the movie. 1608 through 1754, the Pilgrims show up. They found Philadelphia, not the Pilgrims. Other people found Philadelphia. Slavery comes. Basically, slavery comes. They start enslaving people. Essentially, everything that we think of as colonial America takes place from 1608 to 1754. 1754 through 1763, the French and Indian War rages on all over the world in the 7 Years' War, and in North America with the French Indian War, the British, of course, go into debt. 1763 through 1775, the British pass some taxes, they proclaim a bunch of stuff, they kill 5 people in Boston, there's laws passed, there's laws repealed, there's a tea party that does not involve pinkies out at all, it just involves, teas, harbors, you know the drill. So that kind of brings us up to where we are now. So we're going to start taking a look at the actual war itself. So we need to take a look at the American Army versus the British Army and the strengths and weaknesses. Go ahead and fill out your chart as we go along. The strengths of the American Army first. The American Army had very strong military leadership, starting at the top with George Washington. They also had a significant advantage because they were fighting at home, right? By fighting at home, you know the terrain, you know where you're going, you know where possible errors are going to come. It also means that you're fighting to protect where you live. Right? Home field advantage is not just for sports. It's even more important in war. If you're fighting to protect your home, your family, your town, that goes a long way. You're going to fight a lot harder. The final strength was that they eventually got a really nice alliance in place with France. France, of course, always upset with the British, found a good opportunity to get back at them by allying with America. Our weaknesses, on the other hand, we didn't even have an army at first. What we had was a set of small militias with very, very weak training. So we didn't even have an army. We had very few supplies, very few weapons, which is a problem in war, obviously. And finally, we did not have any sort of navy whatsoever, while the British had the world's #1 navy, which brings us to their strengths. They had exceptionally well-trained soldiers, well-educated, well-experienced. They had a tremendous amount of supplies and weapons. It was not an infinite amount, but they could be resupplied regularly where the American colonists could not. And they had the support of loyalists. Loyalists were American citizens, or not citizens, American colonists who did not want to fight for freedom. They wanted to remain a part of Great Britain. And they were throughout the colonies, primarily in the South, but even up in New England and Boston even, there were loyalists who were supporting the British Army. They did have weaknesses, though. One major weakness is that they were fighting far from home. If you're a soldier who grew up in London or Oxford or Liverpool, and now you're sent to fight in Boston, what do you know about Boston? You know nothing. On top of that, you don't particularly care, probably. I mean, you're fighting for Britain, but you're not protecting your home or your family or your friends or your town. So that's a major problem. Second thing, they relied on soldiers called mercenaries. Mercenaries they're like hired guns. They're groups of soldiers who will fight for whoever pays them. In this case, the British relied heavily on a group called the Hessians, they were from Germany. And they were basically willing to fight for whomever. The problem is that they really don't care because they're just fighting for a paycheck. They're not necessarily going to be the most loyal soldiers. You can't necessarily count on them. And if you can't pay them, who knows what they're going to do, right? They might turn on you. The final weakness of the British Army was that they were overconfident and they were arrogant. They were the greatest army in the world, the greatest navy in the world. How could these American upstarts possibly touch them? So they had a major sense of cockiness and arrogance about them. Okay, let's actually start into the war now. The war starts on April 19th, 1775 with the battles of Lexington and Concord. It started out when the British marched out of Boston. They marched sort of west-northwest towards Concord, Massachusetts. Their goal was to capture a stash of weapons or a cache of weapons that the colonists had been stockpiling. By the time they got to Concord, the weapons were long gone, but that doesn't matter. In the meantime, a guy named John Parker, hey, there should be an apostrophe there. John Parker and his militia were camped out outside on the road in Lexington just to, just to sort of scare not really even scare the British, just to sort of show that we're here. And he said this famous quote, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." It's not really clear who fired first. What we do know is that there were about 77 Americans or, Lexington militiamen at Lexington, and there were quite a few more British soldiers. It's not clear who fired first. What is clear is that it did not go well immediately for the Americans. There were, I think, 9 or 10 dead, 8 or 9 injured. It did not go well. The British continued marching on to Concord. So the British won at Lexington. In the meantime, though, militiamen from all over rushed to Concord to try to sort of intercept the British. And amazingly enough, the greatest army in the world, the British, did not see this coming because the American soldiers were not going to wait and line up on a pit, on a battlefield in formation and fight. They were just going to start shooting, and that's exactly what happened. The British were forced to surrender, to basically run all the way back to Boston with the colonists chasing after them, firing on them. It was a humiliating defeat for the British. They were not supposed to lose to these sort of upstarts, right? The greatest army in the world should not lose to, as I've referred to them before, they should not lose to farmers with guns. This is the Denver Broncos or the Green Bay Packers losing to the Parkway North freshman team. It's just, it should not happen, but that's exactly what happened. Why was this so important? Well, this was the point of no return. Once shots are fired, you're not going to solve things peacefully. This was a battle between the British Army. This was 2 battles between the British Army and colonial militias. This was a military battle. They're not going to sit down at the table and compromise anymore. It was going to be solved through violence. So in other words, the war had begun. One important note, whatever that first shot was, whoever fired that first shot at Lexington, that became known as the shot heard round the world. This was a group of colonists who were rising up and rebelling against the British Empire. This was basically unheard of. The problem now is that we don't actually have a leader of the army. Up steps George Washington. So let's get a picture of George Washington. Okay, let's find one of him not on a dollar bill. Okay, we got a quarter. Can we get another picture of George Washington? That's George Washington Carver. Let's try another one. Okay, that's Washington Irving, the author. Oh, okay, that's Irving Berlin. He's a composer. Oh, come on, that's just Berlin. You're not even trying any. That's what I'm talking about. So finally, we get that old handsome, happy-looking guy, George Washington, in here. He was given control of the entire Continental Army. His first major problem was there was no Continental Army. It would be like given control of a sports team that had no players, no stadium, nothing. He literally had money and time and a title. So it was his job to sort of put these things together and find a way to take all these disparate, separate little town militias and somehow make them into an army. Meanwhile, in Boston, we had the Battle of Bunker Hill. This, in case you're curious, and I know that you are, you always are, and that's what I love about you. It really is. I really do. I'm sorry, where was I? Right, this is a map of Boston. Actually, it's not. Boston is down here. This is a map of, I don't know, it's a peninsula, it's near Boston. Let's not sweat it. This is Bunker Hill. So we're talking about the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Battle of Bunker Hill took place on Breed's Hill. I don't know either. You're just going to have to go with it. So let's repeat. This is Bunker Hill. This is Breed's Hill. We call it the Battle of Bunker Hill. I got nothing. The colonists fortified the hills outside Boston. Their theory was if they could control the port of if they could control those hills, they could control access to the port of Boston. If they could control the port of Boston, they could control Boston. If they could control Boston, they had an opportunity to have the most important port in America under their control. That was an excellent idea, and the British also thought of that. And so the British attacked. This was the first time there was basically a planned battle. The colonists knew the British would attack. The British knew they were going to attack, but there were a few issues. First, the British did not have time to adequately prepare. They figured, oh, look, there's farmers with guns. Now they're on a hill. Okay, so we'll attack. Unfortunately, if you know anything about war, which I know very little, but I'll tell you what I know, you never want to attack uphill. Why? Gravity. You always want to attack downhill. It's easier to attack running downhill if you have to. You have a better range with your firearms when you're shooting downhill. You're less worn out when you're fighting downhill. So the British, of course, were fighting uphill. They eventually won. They controlled the hills above Boston. They basically blockaded and shut down the port of Boston once again. But it was a really, it's called a Pyrrhic victory. A Pyrrhic victory is when you win, but the cost was so high anyway that it almost wasn't worth it, because the British lost a massive number of their troops. It cost them a tremendous amount of resources, and the only reason they really lost is because the colonists ran out of bullets. So the British controlled these hills, but they took such a massive hit that it almost wasn't even worth it to them. And so who really cares? Even though the colonists lost, it showed the colonists that they had the ability to fight with the British. It became a rallying point for the colonists, right? And it kind of pushed the British out for a little bit near Boston. They weren't really able to, they didn't recover very quickly from it, but mostly it showed the colonists they could fight with the British, and it became a rallying point for the colonists to say, hey, look, we can do this. The only reason we lost was a lack of bullets. We're fine, right? So now the problem at this point, so we've got these 2 battles under our belt. We won well, 3 battles. We lost Lexington, we won at Concord, and we won at Bunker Hill. At the moment, we don't really have anything we're fighting for. Right now, we've just got 2 battles in and around Boston, and it's basically still just like it's like a domestic insurrection. It's just like it's an uprising internally, until a date that I hope you know. It's called July 4th, 1776. That is when a group of 3 men, surrounded by apparently fast food containers, get together and they sign the Declaration of Independence. Yeah, I just found that animation. I'm feeling pretty good about it, though. At this point now, by the way, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Ben Franklin, early McDonald's, this gave the colonists something that they were fighting for. Now they were not just fighting to get sort of their rights back, which is it's kind of abstract, right? Like, oh yeah, we'll know we win when we have our rights. That's kind of hard to pinpoint. Now they were fighting for freedom. They were fighting to be independent countries from Great Britain. They were fighting for political freedom, which is 2 things. First of all, it's a much bigger deal than simply fighting within the empire, because now you actually have to beat the empire. Secondly, it's a big deal because it gives the colonists something to rally around. They now have a common theme, a common goal in mind, right? It's no longer just, man, those guys up in Boston sure hope they pull it off. Now we're fighting for our own freedom, our own hopes. So we move forward. The problem with the army that George Washington put together at first was that the soldiers were only enlisted for about a year. So by the end of 1776, their enlistment started to run out. People started to leave the army. On top of that, they weren't getting paid very well. They weren't getting paid very quickly. Oftentimes, they didn't get paid at all. They were supposed to, but the checks didn't come, as it were, because, well, we didn't really have a government yet. It wasn't a very functional army yet. They had won some battles, but it wasn't really, you think of the American army today, you think like a juggernaut that, beats everyone. That wasn't it at all. So George Washington had to do something to increase morale and to convince Americans to re-enlist so that the army didn't collapse, okay? So on Christmas night, 1776, he led a surprise raid on Hessian mercenaries. Remember, we talked about mercenaries. They're not necessarily all that loyal to you. They're there to be paid. This particular group may or may not have had a little bit too much celebrating on Christmas Day and was not necessarily in its prime condition, shall we say. So that night, George Washington led his troops across the Delaware River and it was miles and miles and miles, not across the river, but the whole thing, the marching across the river, the whole bit, was miles and miles and miles. It was freezing cold. James Monroe, future president, was in his brigade, and he got really cold that night. He was injured in that battle when he was walking, and he got real cold. He had hypothermia, guys. Don't laugh at James Monroe. Okay, I'm going to do it for you. I'm going to laugh at James Monroe. Anyway, what happened? So they attacked basically where the Hessians were camped out, celebrating Christmas night. The Americans won overwhelmingly. They killed an awful lot of the German soldiers, the Hessian mercenaries. They also took the rest of them captive. They were prisoners of war. So the Americans won a huge victory. Who cares? Well, we care because it convinced a lot of American soldiers to re-enlist in the Army. It saved the Continental Army from completely collapsing, right? If the Army collapsed, the Revolution collapses. The United States, or what becomes the United States, does not gain its independence yet. So this very possibly salvaged the American Revolution. It was a very, very big deal. Moving on, about another year later, we get the Battle of Saratoga. British General Burgoyne, which is my favorite name to say, Burgoyne. I'm sorry, I'm going to try to say that a little more seriously. British General Burgoyne. Couldn't do it. He tried to divide the Northeast by cutting New York in half. What he did not count on was that the Americans were going to fight what we now would call a guerrilla war. We're not going to line up on a field. We're gonna sneak through the woods. We're gonna fire when they're not expecting it. We're gonna chop down trees and block the path. You have to realize that the British were traveling with an unbelievable amount of stuff. They had carts, they had wagons, they had all kinds of stuff that they were pulling. Included in that, it wasn't just weapons and food, which was important, but it was also they had wagons filled with fine china for the officers to dine on. Right? Even the horses themselves, horses are great for going fast in some cases, but not if they have to go over huge trees that are down. And that's kind of that's what the Americans did. They knocked down trees all over upstate New York along the path where the British were going to go, and they made it nearly impossible for the British to get through. So they fought two battles along the way called the Battle of Saratoga. The first one was a British victory, but it was another Pyrrhic victory, right? They won, but they took huge losses. They didn't gain anything of value, but the Americans had to retreat, so technically it's a win, but it wasn't any real value. The second battle was a massive American victory. What makes this victory so incredibly important was that at the moment, America had no allies at all in the world, none. British had lots of allies. They weren't using any of them except the Germans, but they had them. There was basically no one officially helping the Americans. But there were they were called envoys or diplomats, sent over that were in Paris negotiating with the French. The French had been basically at war, not at war necessarily, but basically they had been opposed to the British for approximately, and I'm not exaggerating, approximately 700-800 years. So they were kind of looking for a chance to stick it to the British after the French and Indian War. And this battle came at just the right time and convinced the French that they should help the Americans. It convinced the French to give us a massive financial loan, borrowed a ton of money so we could pay our soldiers, we could buy new supplies, we could buy new weapons. France also agreed that they would help us by supplying a navy, which we did not have and the British did have. Now, the French Navy could not defeat the British Navy, but if the French Navy could even slow down the British Navy, that would be helpful. Why? Well, the British Navy could resupply the soldiers on the ground. If the French could slow that down, it might give the Americans an advantage. But we're not done yet. So now we had the French on our side, but we were still not out of the woods yet. Then that winter, 1777, 1778, you'll notice that in history we seem to run across a lot of these really, really bad winters, right? Remember Jamestown had a couple of runs of bad weather. Winters come up a lot. Why? Because in an age before heat, before, central heating, the weather was a significant factor to deal with. So the winter of 1777-78, General Washington's army settled in at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Valley Forge is not a battle. It's simply the name of a place where the army set up camp for the winter. This was one of those winters, like we talked about at Jamestown. It was brutally cold. It was incredibly, incredibly snowy and icy. It was one of those sort of once-in-a-century bad winters. Washington's army still did not have enough food or supplies. At the beginning of the winter, there were 10,000 American soldiers. More than a quarter of them, more than 2,500 of these soldiers died from starvation, disease, exposure, other things. Well, how is this a good thing? Well, they spent the winter drilling and training, right? Washington managed, primarily through force of will, to hold the American army together, to hold the Continental Army together. This experience, though it obviously hurt the army by losing a quarter of the men, the experience made the remaining men significantly tougher. It gave them time to drill military tactics and discipline into the men. So it's sort of seen, in retrospect, it's seen as this example of horrible, horrible conditions, but also of sort of the American spirit and the ability to overcome these awful conditions. So who won? No one won. It wasn't a battle. Why is it important? Because Washington held the army together and the experience made the army that much tougher to beat. Fast forward a couple years. October 19th, 1781, Yorktown, Virginia. At the beginning of the battle, there were about 11,100 Americans, about 8,800 French. This was fighting against about 9,000 British and Germans. On top of that, there were 29 French warships that were surrounding this peninsula. So the British were sort of backed onto the peninsula with the Americans and the French sort of forcing them back, all right? The outside, there was the British Navy, but the British Navy was being kept out by the French Navy. The British were surrounded. Who won? Well, the British were forced to surrender their entire army to George Washington. When you surrender your entire army, you lose. You can't come back from that. That's a tough one to bounce back from. Well, who cares? America cares. That's who. This is the moment at which we won the war. With the British Army surrendering at Yorktown, the Americans had won the war. We were free. Well, mostly. Freedom does not necessarily apply to all people in all states. Exceptions include people of African descent, Native Americans, women, children, non-Christians, and many others. South Carolina retains the right to cancel any and all freedom at any time, often not valid outside, or really, let's get down to it right now, the inside of the United States. And that makes George Washington happy. Yay! Look how happy he is. Remix! Go ahead and make sure you've got your chart filled out the right way. I'm going to leave this up for a couple of seconds, but obviously you're better off just pausing it. That is the ever so brief version of what happened during the American Revolutionary War. That's right, 23 minutes. Pretty darn brief. Thanks.